Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, a Women's Congress for Future Generations project. Today, we're speaking with Kaitlin Butler. Kaitlin is a senior immigration specialist in Salt Lake City, Utah. Kaitlin's work has been at the crossroads of environmental and public health, climate and intergenerational justice, decision-making in the face of environmental risk, climate change communication, and the social dimensions of climate risks. As many of you know, Kaitlin also used to work with Sen, so we're excited to check in with her and see what she's been up to. Hi, Kaitlin. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Hi, how are
Thanks for
you?
having me. I'm
Of
doing
course.
well.
So, catch us up. What have you been working on lately?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, hi, Sen. Hi, everyone. No secret, I used to work with all of you guys, and so I'm so thrilled and really humbled that you reached out. I am currently working in the realm of immigration law, and I work for a law firm. It is a worldwide law firm, but it's headquartered in New York. We focus on employment-based immigration law. So a lot of our work we do with the companies. We work with departments for their global mobility goals. And we also do a lot of family-based and pro bono work just by virtue of it being integral to the conversation around immigration in general. So at the surface, that's what we're up to. And then specifically within the team that I work on, I also work a lot with the kind of double-sided coin of my expertise, which is I do a lot of interpersonal relationship building, conflict resolution, client retention, and then I do a lot of our data work. So at the risk of sounding vague and mysterious, a lot of immigration work is done with paper. And our firm has been in the process of digitizing all of that work, our history of work, as well as ways of moving the work forward in this ever changing tech environment. So I've been a huge part of the bigger project with the firm of how that digitization is rolling out.
Gotcha. So, this field is a little bit different than what you were doing previously with Sen, and your work environmentally there. Can you tell us a little bit about, that transition? How, I don't know, like what interested you in working in this field?
Sure. So coincidentally, this firm is a place that was my first job out of college. So I graduated back out of undergrad in 2007. And it was right before the big recession, the big crash. I had started working at this firm and was with them through that moment in history. And as a young person, this was my first serious adult job, learning how to use the fax machine, things like that, proper email etiquette, censoring my Facebook, all of that stuff happened in this space. So the person that I work for now really met me at a time in my life when I was just spreading my wings, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my degree, which had focused on, I was in sociology, but I was really interested in the dynamics that are born out of the socioeconomic histories that we carry with us. So more specifically in the US, that was a lot of stuff having to do with race relations. And how do we, what are these stories of these identity politiques? How do we talk about what is normal, what is taboo? That lended itself really nicely to being interested in the movement of humans. I had always been very interested about community, how it's built, what happens at that ground level of movement building. So all of this stuff was sort of fomenting when I was a young person, but I I didn't really know what my passion, I couldn't say that I had a passion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I started at this firm, I was doing this work. It was very interesting, but I felt that I was missing something. So I was really open with my boss at the time, and had started looking around at some of the job fairs in the city. I was living in New York City at the time, and I came across this program that Columbia University was offering. It was a master's program called Climate and Society, and I was wrapped by the brochure, and then by the conversation that I had with the representative. And it was within weeks I was dropping any ideas of pursuing a law degree or law, and had pivoted sharply to letting my boss know that no, in fact, I was going to need to quit and apply to a graduate program in science. He was very supportive and very confused and sent me on my way. So, long story short, fast forward, I really felt like I had found that story that made sense to me. It was something I could lash my energy to and really apply what I felt was important to the world. So I went through this program, learning so much, and in that experience, and through a bunch of lovely humans and webs of relationships, met Carolyn Raffensperger, who equally dropped me to my knees and made me want to lash my sails to her and
Mm-hmm.
follow her wherever she went, because likewise she was able to speak to systems in a way that just resonated with me in the same way that the climate science had. So then find myself back at this immigration law firm as the job that I took after Sen is just a very lovely irony to me.
Coming back full circle.
Yes, and I think I lost track of the later part of your question, but I you'll have to remind me. But that was sort of how, the short, brief, rapid history of my job, my job resume.
Right. Well, so I guess it just kind of leaves the other question of, so you were really involved in environmental work. You were with Sen at the time of Standing Rock, and really working closely with that. So I guess my question is, in your current job, do you still feel um, fulfilled? You're not really working quite in the sphere of environment. I mean, I realize you're still working in community, um, but I guess maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
No, sure. That is such a great question. Because, with all transparency and humility to my current position, something that I have been speaking with them about is the fact that no, I am certainly not interested in positions that don't at some point consider this, not only the environment, but this bigger question and calling that I have a passion for, which is this climate change moment that we are in,
Mm-hmm.
and what we're going to do about it. Something that is ever present, and that I wish I could get more detailed on, but that I'm going to have to wait until I can see what foments out of it. But this is a conversation that I've been having with the firm. So many people who aren't familiar with climate change or climate science will hear that term, and they will think of things like environmentalism, and then they
Mm-hmm.
will immediately think of things like sustainability goals. How could we reuse, recycle, things that are part of that conversation, but not the direction or the angle that I would take it. And so
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that, and what really came out of the work with Sen, what came out of the work with Standing Rock, and just so much that exploded out of that time, because it's not like people haven't been doing this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like those people in Standing Rock have not been leading the charge on so many of these justice issues. But it felt to me as an observer, witnessing all of this, that there was something there were these tipping points happening, whether that was the amount of attention that the topic was getting in the media, or just the power and the leverage that a person had to speak to get a microphone in front of them. Something was happening around this shift when I was actually, sort of making this transition away from the nonprofit world into the private sector. And the decision there was strategic. It wasn't, I don't want to act like I was abandoning something and moving on to something else. My thinking was, it was a grief. It was a reckoning with the idea that for a really long time, in school and after school, I had been taught and really trained to believe that if we could figure out a way to communicate the science well, if we could, as scientists, really show up in these spaces that maybe weren't traditionally for scientists, but if we could really show up with our integrity in that moment and bring the power that science could bear to the issues at hand, that would matter. And as we began to participate in those spaces, you saw, as Standing Rock was a great example of, you saw the ways in which, number one, the science is tertiary to the things that people want to talk about.
Mm.
Number two, there are the laws and the policies, and then there's the interpretations of the laws and the policies that people will follow or not. And so I felt so naive all of a sudden in the ways in which I had believed that if we did good work, good things would happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to mince my words and say that I had some naivete around like what it means to be an environmentalist and the dedication, the lifetime dedication that is. I mean, Sen is a perfect example of what that looks like when you look at the legacy of work that Ted and Carolyn have built. That is a legacy because they are still working on some of the issues that they've been working on for 20 years, and they won't stop, they won't rest. And that's what it means to be doing this work. What I mean by naivete is that I all of a sudden became very aware that I personally maybe wasn't going to be my best superhuman self. My superpowers weren't going to be able to be flexed in that space. And on the contrary, perhaps the best way I could step into the privileges I had been afforded in this lifetime would be to pivot into the spaces that I was afforded and leverage those. So I made an active decision to move to the private sector, an active decision to get back into some kind of work that felt familiar, but equally dealt with this idea of a very much interconnected system of which there are major changes happening. And, how are those things going to overlap is a huge fascination for me, and one that I want to bring to the firm that I work at now, in some capacity.
Yeah, I right before, our conversation last week, I was speaking with Megan Sheridan, and she used to work for I Matter in the nonprofit, and she actually, interestingly enough, is also working in the law field now. But she was kind of talking about these same issues, nonprofit versus private sector, and kind of, she was questioning, will she ever go back to nonprofit? Due to some other issues with nonprofits and the environmental movement as well. But she also mentioned feeling naive. And I kind of asked her, how sad is it that we're looking at things as individuals feeling naive, when really that's kind of like systemically, the problem is systemic, right? So it's not that we're naive, it's that there's a problem because the good work is not producing good results. And how we internalize that as being naive when like that's a sad development.
Mm.
And I think that that's so widespread. You think, well, I should have known better, but no, really, society should be better. um, so it's, but I, completely shared both of your sentiments on that. That's something I think about all the time. I also was just curious, thinking about the environmental field and climate change and how, they're so much obviously connected to law and the law field in general, but more specifically with climate refugees. And we're seeing a lot of, mobility needs there because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of was thinking maybe that was a bridge that
Yep.
you were seeing in your work. So.
Yep. Yep. You hit the nail on the head. And to speak to, and to kind of tie that back with your really good point about perhaps a generational difference between the role that nonprofits played, because as you pointed out so well, so much of this stuff has been borne out in real time, and the role and the power that these different sectors played is changing.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows, how all of this stuff interacts with itself. But I absolutely agree. I think that there is we are seeing a challenge to our institutions at every level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and it's a good thing. I think institutions should be challenged. And maybe as again, as you put so well, the internalized naivete is that realization that I can't put it any other way than having a very childlike feeling like, hey, wait, the adults in the room don't even know what's going on. Like,
Right.
you guys told us there were rules, but there's no rules. Whose rules are we playing by? As Carolyn used to put so well, like, we've run the experiment, we know the outcomes. Why are we running this over and over again? Sort of this naivete, but that was coming with these questions I had that were rooted in a disappointment and an anger.
Yes.
And so how to channel that into a space that would be productive, because I was just also so angry. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I could see how that in the spaces I was in, it wasn't gonna do anybody any good, because those spaces are already fueled with emotion. So anyway, but to get to your point about the climate refugees, amazing point. Yes, natural bridge, 100%. There is a huge vacuum when it comes to the actual policies that support that definition.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, as you've seen, are having there isn't even really an overt definition for a climate refugee, but
Right.
refugees, that definition in and of itself is being now questioned by there's ways in which, as we've witnessed over time with all things policy, we would hope that we would create institutions that would allow for the rule of law to take precedent over, and really underpin our principles as a country or as a world when it comes to this stuff. But as we've seen, we haven't quite gotten there yet. And so a lot of it can be impacted by the opinions and the principles of these shorter term administrations. And like with climate, that has rippling effects. So the inability to account for the amount of people moving around the world now because of whatever reason, it doesn't even necessarily have to be negative, though you already see that there is a bunch of movement happening that we can directly tie to climate change. But there's a lot of movement anyway because of the booming technology sector, because of global corporate capitalism, because of all of these things. There is movement, and we've seen how most people cannot handle large groups of people moving at once. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
is not built into our system. We as nation states, this whole thing we've created out of the world wars, it's not built for that. And it's stressing the system. So what do we do about it? And how do those things get compounded by things like climate? You know, this is a little bit of a tangent, but what it makes me think of, and something I've been thinking about a lot, but maybe haven't formed. So I apologize if it's
No, go ahead.
nonsensical, but I have been thinking about, why is it that I am drawn to these two seemingly intractable problems, right? Like, why
Right.
are you could have been anything. Why are you going after these two worlds that, in terms of being Americentric, is the hottest topics that people love to like dig their heels into, in terms, and that a lot of that digging in is rooted in a what I'm realizing is my bigger question, which is, I think I might be more fascinated now with um, a knowledge crisis that we're having, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this climate stuff, the immigration stuff, the movement of people, the movement of the weather, movement of all the planet that we live on, everything that Sen talks about. If we were to take a bird's eye view and really look at how we would go about, if we were the people constructing the hypothetical game, how would we go about taking account for the state we're in right now? And the first thing that comes to mind as the crisis, I don't know the crisis, if that's the right word, but that feels the most pressing, is we are no longer uh, agreeing on what is the reality of the situation. We don't have a consensus anymore around, and I'm not just talking about like what is truth versus what is not. I think I mean it, and again, why it's so ill formed, but I think I mean it more in a like, what is our, what are we going for here as humans on this planet? What's our goal? What's our bigger picture goal together?
Mm-hmm.
And as like, again, sort of naive as that sounds, it reminds me so much of the challenge that Carolyn used to put and Ted used to put into our conversations all the time, which was, yes, but what are the conditions that we are creating to make that possible?
Mm-hmm.
How, we're talking about these things we want to happen in the world. What are the conditions for that? Is the ecosystem even capable of holding that space? And I think when it comes to things like climate, immigration, the ways that we are talking about it are now so far abstracted from what is happening on like the day to day for people,
Mm-hmm.
that it feels, I don't have an answer. It's
So
quite intimidating.
this is just my thought, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
please tell me if I'm wrong and like taking you off track. But this is something I teach grad classes here and there, and the class I'm teaching right now, one of the things that I talk about and we talk about kind of extensively is the fact that we don't want everyone to understand this knowledge. I mean, we do, you and I do, and people in the course do, and people who are doing all this good work absolutely do. But, the people who started all of these institutions and, throughout our history, they have intentionally made it very difficult to talk about the day to day because that gives people power. And
Mhm.
so it's so much easier for a small amount of people to have the power if they control the knowledge and how we're talking about things. If we're not using, any kind of like community-based or vernacular approaches to knowledge, then we are essentially keeping people under our thumbs.
Mm.
Um, and I feel like I personally, I have such a problem with the ways that we talk about science and environmentalism. And we make it so intentionally difficult for the average person just to like say what they think because they're intimidated, right? You are an incredibly knowledgeable, educated, experienced individual with these incredibly big ideas, yet you feel intimidated approaching this problem. And I think that is such a systemic thing that was really born out of an intentional effort to make it so. And there's a lot of, it's called a epistemological injustice, right? So your rights as a knower are being limited. And I think that, that's such a huge problem that we have right now, and within the greater environmental movement, including law, including everything, is a way that we're talking about all of these things, because we're not being inclusive, we're not being accessible. And so it makes it impossible to think about things on a day-to-day basis, because everything's so huge and intractable. But that's kind of how the people who have all the resources kind of want it to be, right? Because then it's easier for them. If we feel like it's so unapproachable, that's how I see it. So I don't know if you feel like along the same lines, but.
No, you gave me chills just now. Yes, 100%. And so well put. Again, to kind of go off of this, but it's a little bit of a tangent, but love sci-fi. I'm obsessed with sci-fi. And I've been recently thinking about the series Dune. And have you ever heard of the series Dune?
I have not. I'm super interested now, though.
Frank Herbert. Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm very interested in sci-fi that spans thousands of generations, thousands of years. And one of the things that Sen really introduced me to, and that started to creep up again in my mind, and trying to figure out how to embed this climate conversation into what I see as such a natural space, right? An immigration offer. And oh my gosh, of course this is going to impact our work and everybody. Yes, but figuring out a way to hold space for that and find room for that conversation, because it's not at the tip of everybody's tongue. So thinking about these things that were given to me as such big gifts from working with Sen, and getting to be mentored by those principles, which, this intergenerational justice. When you said epistemological justice, injustice, that to me speaks to this conversation that we have about rights and responsibilities to future generations. And I think a lot about how we are archiving information now. So I know we talk a lot about the future and about forecasting. We talk about that in climate a lot, and in business and the private sector and all of that. You're thinking about future changes and future growth. But in my experience with some of the work I've been doing now, and some of the work, and then observing some of the things that I've been seeing in the media, specifically around how the current administration is willing to limit that amount of knowledge that's being put into some of this climate stuff. I'll get more specific. That was a side tangent, but to finish my thought, it feels like, oh my gosh, is this intergenerational justice conversation a bigger human conversation about who has the right to history, who gets to write the history books? Isn't that always been the biggest issue? We are always constantly finding that a certain specific story was told and everything else was left out. And that because of that, we find ourselves rediscovering the exact same information over and over again, because for some reason, we as humans have not managed to take this gift we have of memory and of storytelling, and in recent times we have not figured out how to embed that with the internet and with this capacity for documentation and data and pattern finding, and store it somewhere and have a consensus about it. So I hear you. I'll leave it at that, because I'll just go on some rant, but I'm so fascinated with the injustice that you speak to as it relates to not just our futures, but our pasts. And what are we going to be actively doing today to be sure that we're coming up with some consensus around memory, especially because we're moving it all to digital.
Right.
So I do think about that a lot. And what I meant by that, the last thing I'll say is, what I meant by that random example is, I was so shocked this year, and yet it pulled out my biggest fear, which was watching a political administration, so our president, choose to limit or propose that we limit the amount of data that would be included in the climate models for the National Climate Assessment, which is something that I used to work on when I used to be a researcher after my graduate degree. They were putting in efforts to try to limit the amount of years, the decades that you would include in those projections forward, which limits the scenarios that you're building in, which limits the ways that you're looking at the different probabilities and possibilities of risk, right? It was just not talked about that much except for these circles that I still am connected with. And yet it felt like the beginnings of something horrifying, which is all of this information in terms of climate is mostly owned by the government and generated by the government and gathered by the government and stored by the government.
And that's not
right
in the
now
public's best interest, especially now.
Right. Like you're raising up that whole idea of like, if we're talking about generational justice and how are we setting the conditions for the most possibilities for, thriving for future generations, when we're talking about things like the environment is a huge overlooked piece now going to have to be just the documentation of what was and what existed in the environment. Can we capture all of that in time? Can we have a consensus that we can agree that there are things that are being lost that we can document and memorialize? Or will we choose to go a route of rewriting I don't know. Like I said, I could go on a rant about it, but I have been thinking about this very recently because of the ways in which all of this stuff seems to be really coming all together and impacting each other. Everything feels so much more interconnected and yet huge. Like you said, just everything feels huge and intractable.
So one of the things I spoke to,
like,
no,
it was about existential crisis.
No,
and
I mean, but
anxiety.
that's, there are so many different things that I have found in actually doing this project that so many people like within, our kind of age group, and I'm a little bit younger than you are. And then I was also talking to Akila Sanders-Reed, who she works for the Power Shift Network. So she's in Minnesota and she is like a climate organizer. And so she's been fighting against Enbridge Line 3. And she was a part of the kids' climate case.
Amazing.
Yes. And so so she's younger than I am. And first of all, she has taught herself so much about the legal world because they had to, as participants in this case, they didn't have lawyers working for them. So they had to learn all of these processes by themselves. And so she is just so incredibly knowledgeable now. And one of the things that she said that I've been thinking about for a while now, and it made like every cell and fiber of my being like scream yes. It's when we talk about future generations, it's so easy to like move that needle, move that horizon further and further. Because what do we really mean when we're saying future generations? And I think it like makes it's almost like one of those ideal situations for like big companies to be like, well, future generations could mean like in 5 years, but it could mean, in like 55 years. But what she said is she'll go to all of these demonstrations and rallies, and she'll hear everyone saying, yeah, well, I'm doing this for, my kids, for future generations. And she's like, I'm doing this for my mom. Like, because the last 10 years of her life are going to be terrible if we continue to let this happen. And she's my mom. I love her. I don't want her to experience that. And I just thought that's so incredible because that is like a finite point in time. And it's not something that you can just keep pushing the needle on because our lives are not going to span forever. And I just thought, that was such an incredible way of putting that, and like of being wary of yes, we want to do the most good for future generations and preserve a livable future, but like, what are we talking about? Like how are we saying future generations and meeting future generations without allowing that term to be extremely malleable by, like big industries.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was like such a, she has a way of like, she's very similar to you. You both are extremely articulate and concise, but quickly. Like you both speak very, very quickly and pull these ideas together so well. But I just, thought, what an incredible point. And the example that she used and the way she phrased it was so, like, it's just like a gut instinct to accept it. Like, yeah, I love my mom. Yeah, like I love my aunt. I love my uncle. Like that's still the same thing. And it's just such an easy sentiment to cling on to that I just thought, wow, absolutely.
Mm.
So I just thought that was an interesting thing to bring up.
I love that. I think that's so powerful.
I know.
What a sentiment. I would selfishly love to see her put that on paper, expand on that, put it on paper somehow, put it out there in the world. Maybe she has, but that is such a, as you put so well, part of this conversation is part of this conversation is being done so well by the people that are going that are the youngest ones in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the ways that I am again able to survive a day when I'm experiencing my climate grief in its most tangible, visceral forms, I often will try to seek out a younger person, out of our Children's Trust or Greta or Sen's work, your work, younger people, what are they up to? Because, and it's not out of some romanticization of what are the young kids doing. It is because they are the only ones in the room that can hold the space necessary, the maturity and the intellect necessary for this conversation. I feel that truly. I don't even include myself in that category. I have been floored by some of the ways that people younger than me are stepping into the burden that they have to bear, that they have been just without consent given. And I'm going to get teary if I keep saying anything, but I will leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean so the
and
other
that, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, just that's exactly what she said. Like, just what a fucking amazing power that a young person would say that they're concerned about their,
Yeah, their mom. I know. And I mean, it was like something that I had been thinking about so long. And then she just said it within like 3 sentences. And I was like, oh, that's exactly how you would want to phrase that. And it just suddenly,
Yeah.
like all of these thinkings and like, just hours of thoughts could be condensed down to such a powerful and just widely experienced sentiment in 3 sentences. I was like, that's what it is. There it is, right there. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, Akila, you have done it again. Like, you just blown my mind.
Yeah.
And I, in doing this work, doing this project specifically, I've had so many of those moments, and not just young people, but all people in this work, they just like bring something incredible. But one thing that I like forgot to mention before that would have tied my thought together was, there's things that I'm thinking about, things that someone like Akila is thinking about, and it's what we kind of it boils down to is a lot of these same feelings that we're having. So in talking with Megan about the nonprofit sector, and she was feeling all of this kind of disappointment and grief over her experiences there in nonprofit, and you making an intentional decision to move into the private sector to access your privilege and skills there. I just think that it's so interesting because I'm talking to so many people who, yes, you have absolutely been in the environmental field, but you still have very different backgrounds, very different experiences, and yet we're finding these points of tension that are, the same or very similar in all of those backgrounds. We're still butting up against the same problems. And that's been really eye-opening for me, and a little bit validating, but mostly it's so indicative of these greater problems that I think a lot of people in our age demographic are experiencing today. So, I think in college, I was taught to really, glorify the nonprofit world. They're the ones, doing the work outside of the government and all of these things. And then USEN is not the first nonprofit I've worked for. And just like seeing all of these greater problems and issues that are so present, it is disheartening. You do feel naive. But I just thought in doing every single one of these episodes and kind of boiling down to the same problems and having it articulated in very similar ways by younger people has been so interesting. Because not to say that nonprofits are bad, right? Because SEN is a great example of a nonprofit that is great and cares about the people who work for it and the work that they're doing. But I feel like that's not really the norm. And so hearing young people speak to those issues has been really powerful. And it gives you a lot to think about.
What would you think would be the future of the nonprofit world?
I don't know. And I'm certainly not the best person to speak to that. But I think that, and you sort of, touched on this earlier in how systems you need to rethink systems. I think that so many of our institutions need a reckoning and stop and see what you're doing. So one of the problems Megan brought up in our conversation was that there are a lot of nonprofits out there who, right now are very focused on these points of data that say, if we don't fix things by this year, then they're not fixable, right? Or if we don't lower emissions by this amount, then it's so they're willing to do whatever it takes to prevent those things from happening, but at the expense of anyone. Because there's this idea of well, it's utilitarian, right? We might have to step on some people, but we'll preserve our earth in the end. But if those people have already been suffering and then we decide to keep them suffering so that we can hit these goals, is that a problem? And it's just really a good point, to think about that really and truly, because I think it looks different to each person depending on your life experience. Because some people will absolutely say, well, yeah, because everyone wants to live on Earth, so they'll be grateful in the end. But that's not real. That's not true. So it's just it's complicated and complex. But I think, all of our institutions, including the nonprofit world, really need to, have this reckoning, this moment of well, I think we need to rethink what it means to be a nonprofit. What are we actually doing? What are the commitments we're making? Yeah. So again, it feels very overwhelming and like an intractable problem, especially in a time where so many changes need to be made fairly quickly. I do see that as a huge sticking point, right? How do we come up with the changes that are necessary while also bettering the system? including the nonprofit system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It's something my brain hurts a little when I think about is
Mm-hmm.
how much I want to be able to express to the partners at the firm I work at, the idea that I strongly believe, and I believe is something that science could back up, which is when we talk about climate and we talk about climate change, we've been talking about it as another issue to add to the issues that we talk about when we talk about the things that we care about, or the things that or the things that impact your bottom line, or whatever, insert said reason why you'd stack it on a list. But where my brain starts to break is that my understanding of climate science is what it's telling us is in total, right? It is a conversation about a space of which we know no other space.
Mm-hmm.
It is of what we are made. We cannot be outside of it. And all of it is shifting and changing and iteratively, right? And in ways that we may not be able to see in our lifetime. So there's these, we could go on and on for hours together about, I'm sure, the psychology behind why that's hard for the human brain. We could go on and on about why that's a tough narrative to sell to a business. But what I think, to just add to the stack, but one that kind of gets what this conversation has gotten me delighted by is the storytellers. What are the storytellers doing right now? What are the artists doing right now to capture this way of speaking to a thing that is in fact everywhere? I don't know, everything. It can't be a list, part of a list, because it has to just be the new version of, to go back to the game in a short, it's the new version of the game that we're playing. We've already updated. There's a new version coming, right? And that software will update, and whether or not we like it, right? The computer will reboot. And
Right.
those are the terms we have to play by. They're not something we factor into in addition to. Again, hard to find the words, which is why I leave it to the beautiful artists, because maybe words aren't enough, but figuring out a way to get that into people's skin, like that this is happening, and not in the way that we can put on a row on an Excel spreadsheet. It is the new baseline that you pull your metrics from. And we don't even have a full understanding of what that looks like. So, in terms of how I imagine, I've been struggling to imagine coming up with ideas, projects, ways to bring these to the space I'm working in specifically, is maybe something that I don't have an answer. It's just sort of an open question. How do you, as a person experiencing what we as a generation have experienced and what we've become aware of, and where the curtain's been pulled back, I am struggling with how to rein it in to a project, or a nice tidy way to pitch it, because all of a sudden it feels so obvious, right? So that gap is rather than being smaller than what I thought would happen when I went to school for it and I practiced in this field, I keep experiencing that the gap feels even broader. It's like, oh God, it's even harder to talk about just in, ESG, environmental social governance, which is a huge way that people talk about this stuff in the private sector. I don't know if you're familiar with those terms, but it's a way of measuring, and for shareholders and stockholders, what, it's putting numbers, it's putting money, it's putting things that matter. We have to come up with ways to do that. But I just have been finding that that's a whole new thing I didn't expect, is like, oh God, this whole challenge of the communication piece, again, the epistemological injustice, it also feels like such a it's like a delightful challenge, but it's there. It feels very real.
Mm-hmm.
No longer do I feel like I need more. No longer do I feel like maybe that's what I'm trying to get at. I am at this lovely, interesting place in my life where it's not that I don't believe there's not more knowledge to be gained, that there aren't more experts to learn from, but I am feeling this very grounded sense of, wow, we have so much information. So what are we going to do about it? And I remember something that just stuck with me that Carolyn used to say all the time was, what is the minimum amount of information that you need to make a decision, to act? I feel like we've gotten, like on so many levels, we're there. We have enough information to act. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I get really inspired by you sharing those stories from what other people have said, because it feels like people are thinking about it, thinking about ways like, okay, no more trying to translate this or hold space for getting you on board. Like, no, we're here. You're on board or you're not, but there's enough people that are on board that we're going to act now. So that gets me up in the morning.
Yeah.
Another rambling. As you can tell, this has been it's been a year, I think that our conversation, I am want to be rambly, but I think I feel a little bit unformed in this particular conversation, but I want to own it. Like, I've been trying to step into that vulnerability of like, no, I actually don't have anything neat and tidy to say. I'm very curious. I'm very resolved, but I'm also deeply concerned at how overwhelmed I feel.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the goals of this project, for me, has always been, to get people talking, about their stories and everything, but it's not going to be neat and tidy, and neither should it be. If you're a human being and you're constantly evolving and stretching and working in different fields and sectors, I think that it's unrealistic, and I'm far less trusting of someone who's like, yeah, I've got all of this figured out. It's gonna, like, I can tell you A through Z what the plan is, and that I'm super confident in how this is going to play out. Because I, in my own 27 years of experience, have learned that is very often not the case. So if you uh, and I'm less able to hear someone's story who has polished it to a point where I don't see those messy times, those sticking points, those progressions of self, because that's not an experience that I have, right? It's not my lived experience. And I also find that it's almost as, it's not as inspiring, right? If you are hearing from people who are still experiencing these changes and are willing to be vulnerable and say, like, this is the reality and this is what's happening, and I don't know, like, I'm at a point where I'm still trying to figure things out. I feel like, as someone who is listening to that conversation, can be like, oh, okay, so it's okay that I don't have all the answers, right? Because of this person who, through this conversation, I feel like is so successful and so knowledgeable, and so self-possessed. If they are still feeling like, they're not really sure where it's headed, where it's going, then I'm okay. Like, there are still things that I can achieve, that I can reach. And I just think that it helps people to know that things are always changing, and that they're, in order to be quote unquote successful, right? And that means all kinds of different things. Like, there are so many different ways of getting there. And I think that's such an important part of the story to really drill into people, especially young people who are looking to get into, like, the environmental field. I just think that's important to not have it all figured out and polished, and to not hear the same stories of people who are already on the podcast circuit, right? To just talk to real people who are still figuring it out. I think that's, like, one of the best things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So well put. Thank you. Yeah, no, those are good sentiments. And I feel that, I don't know if that ever goes away.
Yeah.
I kind of hope that I don't ever get rid of that sense of awe at like the people around me horizontally or vertically that are doing things that I think are cool,
Yeah.
because I I learn a lot from just it's funny how a little like shock and awe and even jealousy can drive someone to look at something in a different way and question their own decision making. And like you had mentioned earlier, there was such a big part of me that was living out a story about a girl from a small town who wasn't raised with a bunch of money but put in spaces with a bunch of people that were supposed to be able to teach her about what it meant to make a difference in the world. And then my lived experience was that the people that were actually capable of doing that had gone through, or were at least you know actively going through a reckoning with themselves about themselves. They had gone through the process of like ex- looking at what are my superpowers, where can I land and be here and do this work, because now the work is everywhere. Right now the environmental stuff is out of the nonprofit, it's out there. Everything is sort of becoming entangled and becoming as interconnected as they truly are as issues. And so all of these different disciplines are coming, these people are coming together from different backgrounds, as you mentioned. And I had not done that work out of grad. Like I felt like I came out of undergrad and had really, I knew intellectually what I cared about, but I felt like I was very aware and self-conscious of the role and the person I was trying to be. And case in point, I'm incredibly shy. And so being a campaigner and I had gone into science really because I wanted to do the science. So when I found myself in a world where climate stuff had so quickly gone from, oh, you can't even communicate it, we have to be out in the streets. I shared an
Mhm.
office with James Hansen, who is the renowned scientist who had since, in the year I was there, then quit NASA GIST to go begin a nonprofit because he recognized he could no longer work in that purely academic space,
Mm.
and couldn't rectify it. So anyway, the point being, like, it was I am so excited to see what I can bring to this firm. I have delusions of grandeur that involve the idea that there could be, a conversation in the space like global immigration around climate that's not being held. And I would love to be a part of that. My narcissism convinces me that I absolutely should try, because why the hell not?
Yeah.
Um, and then in all of that is this observation, which was, I won't survive that. I won't survive all of this, being out there doing this work that we're all called to do. The bandwidth will be gone if I can't sit with where I actually, again, like I said, can be my full self. So that meant letting go of stuff that I really wanted to be. And that, I think, is something I wish an adult had told me, that there
Mm.
are going to be ideas of yourself that you want so badly. And yeah, maybe it's worth it to try, for sure. And also, it's okay if that version isn't going to because of your lived experiences, because of whatever you've been going through or are going through in this life. Maybe you're not going to, maybe you shouldn't be the keynote speaker at every event. But
Right.
just those little ways that when I think about the word empower now, I use it differently. And I mean it in those ways.
Mm.
And I guess that's kind of want to like leave it at that. Like, yes, a lot of questions, but something I hear echoed across people really wrangling with these questions is that they are also challenging themselves to like step up to the plate in terms of being, stepping into these terms that I felt like really were used a lot, like authentic, self-care, these problematic things that we've been sort of throwing around. I think that people are actually being like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, I actually mean it in this way. And I'm going to tell my boss I need a mental health day. That's what I'm going to do with it,
Yeah.
So now we're on a real tangent, but the point being, I really genuinely, I guess I bring it up to say, I really genuinely think that's kind of the power of the work that the generations now are doing. We know the issues, we have the information. How do we act? There's been barriers to that. Maybe it's as simple as letting everybody sink into their animal body selves and just fucking live a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take a mental health day, all these things that we're talking about kind of tangentially to these bigger environmental law policy questions. It's like, maybe it's just figuring out how to deal with open desk seating and better maternity leave. I don't know.
Right.
Like it's all, it's all very interconnected. And I am fascinated with the ways that the people younger than me and people my age, and myself are like taking the time and energy to question that too, because we
Yeah.
realize that it's necessary.
Yeah, and one of the things that you have done that I mean, because you've worked in the environmental field, but you've spanned through like so many different um, ways of working in that field. And one of the things that you were doing at the time that I started with Sen that I was like just like blown away by was working with Ugly Mag on this Ugly Facts project.
Oh
Can you
yeah.
tell us about that?
Yes, of course. And feel free to cut out like any or all any chunks
No.
of this that are totally, I've lost track of like where we went. But yes, we should totally touch on that. And then I may have to step off after this piece of it.
No problem.
Sorry for those listening. I'm also finishing up some work before the holidays. But we came, so Ugly Mag is a magazine started by a friend of mine here in Salt Lake before I came back to the state, that was focused purely on getting high fashion editorial into the area, because there really wasn't any. And then I had become, again, wrestling, kind of ever wrestling with this communication piece around storytelling and stuff that I cared about, and how do you get people to pay attention these days. And it's funny that it's interesting to hear you say that you were moved by it, because I've actually had a very bad taste in my mouth around the whole thing. So it's, maybe at the risk of like ruining this interview, I loved doing that project, and I will go into it a little bit, but I will say it was very hard for me to not poke holes in so much of what I did, to the point where I felt like I'd been so immersed in the social justice, climate justice world. I was so self-aware kind of how problematic some of the stuff I don't know. I want to relook at that project. I would love to explore it and revisit it. It didn't stop for any dramatic reason. It was just bandwidth, and we all got busy and everyone was doing it for free. But I can't say at this point in that I want to question it. I want to question what it was I was going for. But at the time, I really liked the idea of it was very simple, really. It was this idea of getting people to pay attention to a very scientifically written, so quote unquote, bland fact about climate change. But the only reason that they would be looking at it was because there was a traditionally, aesthetically pleasing editorial page paired with it. So we did themes that were rooted in some of the key impacts that we are seeing from climate change and some of the projections that we will see. And then we paired them with these fashion shoots, and that they were all mostly designed. The art direction was all done by me. The creative direction was all done by me. And then the photography and a lot of the costuming, makeup were done by friends who were just also very interested with this idea. It was very organic. It was people, again, generous with their time. And it was fun, and it was challenging because it was fun to imagine things, but it was even more fun to hear the group wrestle with this stuff. Once they'd heard this new, I would kind of come into a meeting with this new piece of information, and it was really, really fun to watch people get excited by knowing a new thing. I mean, obviously they would then most of the time be like, holy shit, that's happening. But
Right.
that was also kind of powerful, like being part of this little microcosm of awareness. So yeah, I wish I could say something a little bit more, again, cohesive about it, but it is another project that coincidentally has the photographer brought it back up with me, and he wanted to revisit it. And I don't know what I want to say about it. Maybe you have more thoughts.
So I think one of the reasons that I was just really struck by it is I'm not a fashion person. It like doesn't work with my brain. But I was so struck by it because of the juxtaposition of these just straight facts, right? And then this artistically composed picture. And while of course that can bring up some issues, in representation and like how we view women and that kind of thing. Not that there was anything really wrong with these pictures,
No,
but if
you're
you're
hitting on some the holes I mentioned earlier.
right, exactly.
But
I
yeah.
thought that it was a really great experiment into, how we are communicating things that people don't pay attention to. One of the best pieces of advice that I have ever gotten was from my undergrad thesis director. And it was, I had this paper that, of course, was super academic, and I would hate reading again now. But he said, in terms of like presenting this to other people, he was like, focus on what people can hear. So not that people don't understand things, but what is going to make sense to them, what's actually going to appeal to them, and how can you make this relevant? And so I thought that the Ugly Facts Project was just a really great experiment in how to convey these facts that no one would pay attention to until it was paired with something that would attract their eye. And I also think that I really liked it because with the hashtags you can kind of trace like who was talking about it. And so the models and the pictures were like, I got to do this like incredible shoot, and it was about this. And I was like, you never hear that like from any other kind of magazine shoot. It's just like, oh, this is what I'm wearing, this is who did my hair, makeup, whatever. And instead it was these people like, yeah, this photo shoot was for this. And they would state the fact again, and it was just like a very different way of interacting with this knowledge and in the environmental field. I just thought it was just another way of talking about it that was going to make sense to other people, and have them pay attention for maybe like the first time. So that's why I liked it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
thank you for reminding me. I know I've been in this doom and gloom about it, and so it's nice to be reminded. And that was you reminding me of kind of what I was going for and what we were really trying to do with the help of Shadna, who is the magazine owner, and his magazine Ugly Mag was, allowed for me to borrow the Ugly Facts, which was the hashtag. And we were trying to play with this idea of how do you just start creating, how do you make something memeable, how do you leverage in with the most, again, kind of with humility, but with honesty, how do you leverage the behavioral patterns behind social media? So in Instagram, for example, and with a lot of the work that he was doing with with fashion shoots, there are a lot of people involved in the shoot. There's the makeup person, there's the model, there's the lighting, there's the photographer. All of those people, if you create a product that helps their portfolio. I mean, so many of us these days are doing work for free, creative work for free. So a lot of the conversations were about like, hey, we can't pay you, but we'll give you all of these to add to your portfolio, you know. So there was this way that we were trying to get people to buy in for their time. And then also the surprise of having some of the participants get really shocked and want to continue to share just the information was this kind of subtle goal that I had, that it was so cool that it worked.
I thought it was like an incredible point of intervention, right? So you can't recreate and like build a better system overnight, but what can you do to like infiltrate it, right? And then
Right.
start planting these seeds of ideas and, you know, just creating that point of intervention in a space that hasn't traditionally talked about it. I just thought that those were all of the reasons that made it really great.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And maybe you've landed on the exact thread that could tie, you know, your question about like you've expressed your passions in environmentalism in all of these different ways. And, you know, I think that you have hit the nail on the head. And for lack of a better expression, I sure do love to infiltrate. I just am fascinated with the idea of planting little seeds and seeing where they sprout, because I do, like we have been demonstrating in this conversation, I don't presume to have all the answers. And I learned maybe the hard way that my superpower is not having answers. It is that I'm very good at getting people, even sometimes without them noticing, into a space where they're asking a question they didn't know they had, or, you know, having a conversation they didn't think they'd be having. And I like seeing what comes out of that. I think that the power of that, the ripple effects of just creating the conditions for what the human person can come up with. I just am so into that, and I want to activate that. And it's what drives a lot of my decision making now, you know, in the ways that I'm want to do the work in the world, is to activate, because it's all there. The information, the energy, the desire to want to do good. I genuinely believe that people on the day-to-day are trying to make good decisions. And so, yeah.
And I think so, you know, we're going to wrap this up. I know that you're super busy, and I'm so thankful that you have just
No,
dedicated this much
I'm
time.
embarrassed. I'm embarrassed.
No,
I could talk to you for hours,
I know,
Taylor.
and I hope that we do. But
I,
so in just wrapping this up, I wanted to bring us back to the point where you asked, you know, why are you drawn to such intractable problems? And I had two thoughts. One, that's like such a Sen thing to
right.
say and to do, which is fantastic. But I also, in kind of preparing for this interview, went through like your bio and your information. And so I think one thing that Carolyn has definitely said about you is that you bring a lot of grit and grace into all this. That when I read that, I thought that has to be something that Carolyn has said.
Yeah.
But I see that I feel like you have had this have been drawn to intractable problems and challenges like throughout maybe even your whole life. I mean, you were a figure skater when you were younger, like a competitive figure skater, right? And I feel like that is something that requires a lot of grit and grace. And so to me, like I see you as this person who has, you know, gone through life and like sought out all of these challenges in ways that you can like just kind of challenge things and get involved, but also like intervene. And I mean, you do it so well, but I feel like if I'm looking at you as an objective observer from just the data that I have, yeah, like you are just like this perfect example of someone who, yes, you have a lot of grace, but you are so ready to get your hands dirty and to do the hard work. And I think that's incredible and really inspiring. So it has been incredibly difficult to even pretend to like fill your shoes at Sen. And I don't even pretend that that's something that I do.
because
but
you're
yeah.
because your entire being has built out this entire new space, which is so dope to watch, to witness. And thank goodness for it. I mean, and they need young blood. I would tell them all the time. They have to get this. How else are they going to get podcasts and Instagrams up?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I just definitely look to your work as something that inspires me. I know that everyone listening will be just really grateful for the experience of having you speak to all these different spaces and messy aspects of just being a human, and especially working in the fields that we do. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I will take just the moment to say back and to the Sen crew, because I really my brain wouldn't have had its full flexing to hold the space for the types of things I'm trying to wrestle with if it had not been for the mentorship that I've received from everyone on that team, including the board. And I mean, when we talk about the work we're trying to do in the world, you know, those are people that will, in my mind, stand the test of time in terms of the integrity that they bring to the work that they do. And so, you know, when we're talking about systems, we're talking about institutions, I am coming from models. I'm coming from model citizens. And so, you know, a bow to them, a bow to you for doing this stuff, and to the projects like the Women's Congress for Future Generations, that it is the vehicle that gave me the chance to see where my power could be. And I don't know where else. I mean, I just couldn't have imagined another coalescing of circumstances. I just am grateful for it. So thank you for reaching out, being patient with me, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Maybe when I have something to report back on with this whole.
Yeah, that would be great.
You can follow up with everyone you've interviewed in a year and just see how.
Yes, things have panned out. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.